Welcome to another session of lectures by Lob-EZ. I'm your host, Dr. Lob-EZ. Today we're going to be discussing absolutism in Europe, time frame 1500, 1800. Today's video, really what I'm going to focus on is the foundations of absolutism, kind of why it came about, why it evolved, and then some of the key features of it. And then we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into French absolutism, at least the early days of it. Okay, so what this slide shows is the definition of absolutism, and really what that means is when you have a monarch who has total control or sovereignty. Okay, and so the word sovereignty really means supremacy or power. Okay, so their power reigns supreme. And so what that means is the other groups that typically have had power, the nobility and the church, typically this is the Catholic Church, are subordinate, meaning that they're weaker. Okay, and so these three groups throughout the Middle Ages sort of competed with one another for power, for sovereignty. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting is that absolute monarchs had an ally with the growing middle class. And that's really due to the fact that throughout the Middle Ages, there was a lot of warfare amongst the competing nobles. And so what that does is it creates a climate of chaos. And that's just not really conducive to business, to commerce. And so the one thing that an absolute monarch could promise is the stability. There wouldn't, the absence of lawlessness. Okay, so an orderly environment. And so for that reason, they sort of join forces. And this joining of forces between the middle class and monarchs is really symbiotic, mutually beneficial. Okay, and so I'll explain that. Excuse me. So, as far as the middle class is concerned, it's kind of already been stated. Their benefit is that they can conduct business without fear of violence or some other type of unrest, social unrest. As far as the king is concerned, he's going to use the skill set that the middle class has, whether it's, as merchants, or bankers, their literacy, financial literacy that could help him with collecting taxes. And that's going to be key and most important. When it comes to lawyers who were also part of the middle class, obviously they could help the king when it comes to like drafting laws or legislation. Okay, so what we're going to see is the presence of a middle class bureaucracy. And all bureaucracy means in this connotation is it's a governmental agency, okay? And so this governmental agency is going to be the primary focus is going to be, as I said, collecting taxes. And why is that necessary? Well, it's necessary because what really grants the king sovereignty is a permanent standing army, okay? And when I say permanent standing army, I mean something different than what we had seen during the Middle Ages. Typically under feudalism, okay, the system of government that existed before absolutism, you still had the same players. You had kings, you had nobles, you had peasants. But the way it worked was the kings, the monarchs, were too weak to have control over a vast army. They didn't have the finances for it. And so they had to rely on their nobles, and that's where that feudal arrangement really came into play, was that nobles would be granted land from their monarch, and in return for some promise of providing an army or soldiers should war come about. Okay, and so that's how that situation sort of developed. And what this new feature with a permanent standing army means is professional soldiers who spend an entire lifetime serving in the military. And whether it's peacetime or during war, the king can draw on a very large force to face down any potential enemy. And that enemy can be foreign or oftentimes domestic, meaning, he might have his sovereignty challenged by a noble or a group of nobles. And so his army has to be big enough that he can fight all of his nobles, theoretically, and still win. And that's how, you demonstrate that you have true political sovereignty. Okay. The third feature that's important is the presence of a secret police. Okay. So the use of spies and informants to really keep an eye on enemies of the crown. And those enemies of the crown are typically going to be nobles, because they're not keen on the fact that they're losing power. And so if there's an opening or an opportunity to conspire with one another with the hopes of perhaps overthrowing a king in some sort of rebellion, then they're going to be, involved in that. And so the king, the monarch, needs to know if this has taken place. And so what better way to, find that stuff out, ferret out that information than through a secret police. Okay. So their function would be to arrest conspirators and, torture them, and then usually publicly execute them to kind of, make an example out of them for everybody else. This isn't and shouldn't be confused with 20th century totalitarian regimes where we see a lot of secret police, and specifically, I mean, like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union with their NKVD. Now, those two nation states used the secret police to really spread fear throughout the entire population. So the secret police with these absolute monarchs are strictly keeping an eye out on the nobility, okay, or other sort of significant groups or people, okay? So one might ask, where does this all come from? Meaning, where does the idea of absolutism come from? What's it based upon? And the answer is something called divine right, okay? And divine right was not necessarily the brainchild of any one person. It was kind of like a collective, development. But one author was this French theologian, Bishop Jacques Bossuet. And he used scriptures, itself to kind of be the basis for divine right theory. And so what the theory states simply is that the right to govern when it comes to a king comes from God. And if that's the case, then the king is not answerable to any person, group, or institution, okay? And so he really stands above all of that, and his power cannot be challenged. Well, who can then? I mean, if that's, like, who is he answerable to? The answer to that is he's answerable to God. He's answerable to God. So, but let me back up, okay? So let's, to draw an example, or to draw, sort of where Bishop Bossuet was, thinking. So when Jesus gave his public ministry for 3 years prior to his execution, he talked about building God's kingdom here on earth. And one of the prerequisites for that to be established was there had to be peace, there had to be stability, there had to be order. There cannot be lawlessness and chaos, because there's no way that God's kingdom can be built here on earth. So what Bishop Bossuet surmised was that the authority that a king really needs comes from God. Okay, and the fact that the king, just like everybody else, has to be God-fearing, that's what's really going to keep him in line. That's going to prevent him from overstepping his bounds and abusing his power and becoming something like a tyrant. Okay, and so in theory it sounds good, but in reality we're going to find out that this does not work well at all. Okay, so let's take a look at absolutism in practice. So let's go ahead and talk about France then, and how did the absolute monarchy establish itself in France? We have to back up a little bit. So let's go back to the 100 Years' War, okay? When it ended in 1453, we see France in a much more stable position politically, strengthened. You might remember that when we discussed this at the beginning of the year, the French struggled initially for a good part of the 100 Years' War. They were being defeated by the English, but the tides of the war were turned around, were turned by Joan of Arc, and what we see is France in a much stronger position, especially their monarchy. Okay, and why is that? Well, there were two developments, two technologies, two military technologies that were developed during the 100 Years' War: the longbow and the cannon. And what those two weapons did was made feudal warfare pretty much obsolete. Okay, so the longbow could penetrate the armor of a knight, and the cannon could penetrate the walls of a castle. And so the king did not need the nobles to provide him with the military. Not anymore. He can hire these guys out. He can hire longbowmen. He can, equip himself with enough cannon to take down any, threat, whether that's a knight or a noble or whatever. Okay, and so that sort of indicates that feudalism is on its way out, especially in France, and we start to see the rise of some strong monarchies. So for a little over 100 years, we see this kind of situation where the monarchies in France begin to get strengthened. And this is going to be threatened or challenged when King Henry II of France dies, okay? So he was a powerful king, stable, and kind of did his job of having some male heirs. But he was involved in a jousting tournament, and he suffered an accident where his opponent's lance broke, and a shard or some large splinter from the lance penetrated his shield and went into his eye. And because the medical treatment of the time was woefully inadequate, he died from an infection some days later. Okay, and so that leaves him with a widow and a bunch of young children, and his three sons that can rule are all too young. Okay, and so the situation, when that situation arises, we see the king in need of a regent, okay, an advisor, sort of somebody to rule in his stead until he reaches the age of majority, and that is 18. Okay, and so in this particular instance, it's going to be the widow, and that's who's pictured here, and that's Catherine de Medici. Okay, and what's really weird about this story is that she's going to be the regent for all three. Okay, so what happens is the first son dies before he can have a male heir of his own. Okay, and so she's going to have to step in again as a regent, the second son, and then for the third. And so, her kind of acting as the queen mother creates an opening. And not just her, but the three young sons creates an opening, meaning, they seem vulnerable, they seem weak, okay? Not the kind of strong monarchy that Henry II represented, okay? And so, since these nobles have lost power, they're eager to regain it, okay? And so this presents itself as an opening to them. And what's more is Protestant Reformation is underway, okay? So we start to see the spread of Lutheranism and Calvinism, and that's what takes a foothold in France is Calvinism, okay? So we see a growing number of what we call Huguenots, which are French Calvinists, okay? Overall, make up a very small percentage of the population, only 7%. But what's interesting is 40% of the nobility were Huguenots. And so why is that? Well, it's because they're going to use religion as to symbolize their opposition to the crown. Because, of course, the ruling Valois dynasty is all Catholic. Okay, and so these nobles are going to become Huguenot as they're going to take up this religion because they oppose the monarchy. Okay, and so that's going to lead to the triggering of a civil war, all right? And it's not just a civil war, but a religious one as well. And we call those the French Wars of Religion. And they take place from 1562 to 1598. Apologize. So let's take a look at this next slide. So 10 years later, after a brutal and bloody civil war, as most civil wars are, and just a little footnote here, it's important to note that the most devastating thing that could happen to a country is a civil war. Okay, the United States, for example, that was the worst situation that ever happened in 1861. Why? Why is it so bad? Well, because the death toll is, compounded by the fact that you have your, countrymen fighting countrymen. Okay, so in this case, it's French killing French. So it's terribly devastating. Not to mention there are a lot of atrocities committed against the civilian population, and anytime that takes place, there's going to be the side that is the victim seeking, they're going to want to seek revenge against those who perpetrated these violent acts, okay? And so there's going to be retribution, and it's going to go back and forth, and things are going to get very emotional, very heated, and this intense emotion, caused by all this pain and retribution is really hard to get over, okay? And so it can really tear at the very fabric of a country. Not to mention, commerce is going to grind to a standstill. Food production is going to be problematic because you have looting soldiers, marauding soldiers all over the place. And so with these shortages of food, you're going to have famine, and then you're going to have disease, and then ultimately death. So those are just a few of the reasons why civil war is just so terrible, okay? So after about 10 years of fighting, the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, was looking for an opportunity to, reach some type of peace agreement between the throne or the crown and the Huguenots. And so she offers her daughter as in an arranged marriage with the leading family of the Huguenots, and that's Henry of Navarre, okay? And this is, sort of a symbolic gesture to the rest of the country to sort of to say if the crown and then their biggest opponents can put matters of religion aside enough to get married, well, then perhaps peace can be reached throughout the whole country, okay? So that was the idea, and she was going to marry off her daughter, Margaret, to Henry of Navarre. Well, so what ends up happening is we get, hundreds of people, a veritable who's who list in French society, including hundreds of Huguenot nobles are invited to Paris for the nuptials to take place on August 24th, 1572. Which also marks St. Bartholomew's Day. It's a feast day of a popular saint, okay? So, plans change, okay? Not really sure who's behind it, whether it was Catherine herself or some leading Catholic family. There were this group known as the Ultra-Catholics led by the Guise, who may have been behind this. But at any rate, the decision was made that we're going to use this opportunity not to make peace, but to defeat the Huguenots. And so after the wedding, all of the Huguenots in attendance were going to be murdered by royal forces, okay? And that's exactly what happened. And you can see it in this painting above, okay? These acts of atrocities committed against, just so you know, it's Huguenots in Paris. And there are just all sorts of different terrible things being perpetrated against these people, and their bodies are being dumped into the nearby canal. You see naked bodies, women killed and naked, so one is to assume that they've been raped first. There's dead children. There's a man over here who has been decapitated. And then all the way here in the back is this woman dressed in all black, and the assumption is that that's Catherine de' Medici as a widow. She dressed in black to sort of symbolize that she was in a state of mourning. And then she is standing over a group of bodies, sort of inspecting her handiwork, perhaps. Okay, so this event, St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, fails. to be the decisive, moment where the Catholic Valois dynasty is going to win. It just further aggravates the situation, stirs up a hornet's nest, and it intensifies the resolve of the Huguenots, and fighting goes on for much, much longer. Okay? So, as fate would have it, each one, as I said, of Henry II and his wife, his widow Catherine de Medici's 3 sons, all take turns ruling, and then they all died at a very young age, as I said before, prior to having an heir to the throne. And so when the 3rd son dies, it creates an opening, or so it seems. Okay, well, why can't Margaret? Can Margaret be the head of state? As a queen? The answer is no. No precedence in France at this time for there being a female head of state. However, she did marry Henry of Navarre, and so by marriage at least, he's the next in line, so he is going to claim the throne, and he is going to become the next King of France. Okay, so in 1589, Henry IV is elevated to the throne, and so it marks the end of the Valois dynasty and the beginning of the new Bourbon dynasty. So he's the first monarchy of that Bourbon dynasty. One might expect him to want to seek revenge against the Catholic majority of the country, and using his power as king to do that. But you'd be surprised to learn then, if that's what you would think, that he didn't do any such thing. Instead, he converted to Catholicism. Okay, not because he felt the need to become a Catholic for spiritual purposes, but he did because he thought that this would be the surest way to bring peace to his country. Because the vast majority, 90+% of the population was Catholic, so he really thought that that would be the best move, and that was good. But what about the Huguenots? I would imagine they felt betrayed, but he doesn't leave them, dangling or twisting in the wind, because he issues what is called the Edict of Nantes in 1598, and so what that does is it grants religious freedom and toleration for the Huguenots to practice as they please. And not only that, where towns that seem to have a dominant number of Huguenots there, as an extra sense of security, allows them to build walled cities, and then also to have private garrisons or small armies for defensive purposes should they ever be attacked by French forces in the future. So all of these things, these 2 things combined, the conversion to Catholicism and the Edict of Nantes, brings the war to a close. But he's got a big mess on his hand, because this civil war, as I said, was very destructive. And so Henry devotes the remaining years of his reign to fixing the problem, okay, and repairing France and restoring prosperity, okay? And that's symbolized by his quote where he promises a chicken in every pot. He uses a number of public works projects to get people working, kind of using the treasury to improve roads and bridges and to restore agriculture. And all of these things kind of help return the country to prosperity. And unfortunately, though, for him, he was stabbed in 1610 by a religious fanatic, a Catholic, I believe it was a monk, angry with Henry IV, decided to take his life. Okay, and so unfortunately for him, that's going to be the end for Henry. But then he has a young son who's going to be the next king, but he's too young, so he's going to need, and his name is Louis XIII. He's going to need a regent of his own, and there was all these competing forces among the nobles that wanted to be the regent, so they wisely chose a religious figure, Cardinal Richelieu, okay? And that's who's pictured in the portrait above. And he, which is sort of ironic, is like the symbol of French absolutism. Even though he wasn't a king and he wasn't a royal figure, he was simply a regent. he really, under him, creates absolutism. So he strengthens the power, the sovereignty of the monarch, consolidates its power, and subordinates the nobility. Okay. So one of the first things that he does is he looks at this map of France and says, well, there are just too many provinces, because each one of these provinces is sort of governed at the local level by nobles, and that just gives way too much power to these nobles. So instead what he does is he reduces France into 32 administrative districts and sort of removes those nobles from those local governing positions. Who does he replace them with? Well, he replaces them with middle-class bureaucrats, all right? And these middle-class bureaucrats are going to be called intendants, okay? So as you might imagine, their primary function is going to be to collect taxes, but also to recruit men for the military, serve as judges, and also sort of police the activities of the nobility, okay? And he does also establish a network of spies or secret police to uncover plots by the said nobles, okay? Following a uprising at a particular Huguenot city that was difficult to put down. It took several months of laying siege to this town, that he sort of amends the Edict of Nantes and says, okay, you can still have religious freedom, but you just can't have private garrisons or massive city walls, okay? So these steps help him elevate the monarchy to the status in France of absolutism, okay? That's going to do it for today's video. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you guys next time. Thank you.